I want to come to chapter 43, and let's just kind of work through some of the concepts that are going on here, because I think 43 is very significant to the whole thrust of the book. And I think very significant to this part of the book, because chapter 43 talks about the return of the glory to the temple. Remember in chapters 8, 9, 10, 11, we had the departure of the glory of God as it had been initially revealed to Ezekiel in chapter 1, in the vision of 1. And periodically we see this arise just briefly, but it was a specific time within 8 through 11, where the glory of God departed because of the judgment that would come. And the glory leaves and the judgment is executed very soon. And it's gone, and said it will be gone until they are cleansed and restored and returned in that manner to the land, and then the glory of God will reappear. Will return, in that sense, to the temple. So we read in chapter 43 that the man brought me to the gate facing east. Remember, that's the glory of God went to the east gate, then went to the Mount of Olives, and then goes. So now we're coming back to the east gate. Okay? Brought me to the east gate, and I saw the glory of the God of Israel coming from the east. And boy, that must have been a thrill in the midst of the vision that he is in. And when he recounted this to the exiles, I'm sure it was a phenomenal thrill to them. The glory returning from the east. His voice, notice, it's the glory of the God of Israel, and his voice, the God of Israel, was like a roar of rushing waters, and the land was radiant with his glory. The vision I saw was like the vision I had seen when he came to destroy the city, and like the visions I'd seen by the Kibar River, and I fell face down. And that's worship. The glory of the Lord entered the temple through the gate facing east. Then the Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. And while the man was standing beside me, I heard someone speaking to me from inside the temple. And he said, "Son of man, this is the place of my throne." What is the role of the temple in the vision? It is as the throne of God. It is where he resides among his people visually. Now we have to say that to us. We didn't have to say that to them. That's the way they perceived it. It was a temple, yes, but it was the manifestation, the visual representation to them of the presence of God, because this is the throne of God. This is where... And the place for the soles of my feet. Now, obviously, this is a figurative statement. I don't think God is going around showing the bottom of his feet to us here. But so we understand it in our human terms. It is a metaphorical statement. And where I stand among you. Okay? This is where I will live among the Israelites forever. See, there it is. This is the visual representation of his presence. He is with Israel forever. And it's quite a very clear statement of the role in this context of the place of the temple. And where his glory has come back to, which he would not be able to come back to the temple if you didn't have one at that point. The house of Israel never again defile my holy name, neither they nor their kings, by their prostitution and their lifeless idols of the kings at their high places. Now we know about the whole history, the prostitution of Israel. We've already looked at all of that, all the idolatry. These were so prominent in their sin. And when they placed their threshold next to my threshold, that is the king's, and their doorpost beside my doorpost, with only a wall between me and them. They defile my holy name by their detestable practices. I don't know if you understand. He's talking again here about what they did. Past, okay? They put their dwelling place next to my dwelling place. That's exactly what they did in the Old Testament. You know where the house of the kings was? Right immediately south of the temple complex. We know that biblically, we know it archaeologically. Okay? Right next to them, they had a common wall. And he said they did all their detestable practices right next to my holy manifestation to them. And so I destroyed them in my anger. Now, let them put away from me their prostitutions and lifeless idols of their kings, and I will live among them forever. Now keep in mind, this is a revelation to the exiles. And there's some statements of exhortation here as he goes along. It's not just I'm preaching a message here about the millennial temple and the worship, but there's no application. By the way, the problem's back there. The only way that you're here is to put that away, and that stays away, and this forever will not happen here. Okay? Forever, this will be a holy place. I will live among them forever. So, Son of man, describe the temple to the people of Israel, that they may be ashamed of their sins, lest they consider the plan, and if they are ashamed of all that they have done, make known to them the design of the temple. In other words, the temple itself and the holiness is portrayed. Even the fact that it existed to those who were present is a reminder to them of the sinfulness of their people and the sinfulness. Yes, they're in a place of where they're worshiping Him, but part of the worship, as I mentioned, is that I know and remember that I am a sinner, and it's only by the grace of God and the work of the Messiah and His shed blood that I even am here at that point. But it's the temple, its arrangements, its exits, its entrance, its whole design, and all its regulation and laws, write these down before them so that they may be faithful to its designs and follow all its regulations. Now we get the idea that you need to keep living a holy and a righteous life at that point, just as I've been trying to get you to do all along. And now, guys, I think we're going to get it. We're going to do it at this point. This is the law of the temple, what is it? All the surrounding area on the top of the mountain will be most holy. Such is the law of the temple. See, the thrust that's going on here in these chapters is upon the holiness of God. He is holy. You need to be holy. Remember your profane life, your sin. But here, it's holy. And the law of this place is that it is a place of holiness. The whole surrounding area will be most holy. That's the way it will be at that time. Be a manifestation of the holiness of God. Though do remember that there are those who are non-believers who do enter into the kingdom at that time, and there will be those that need to follow and obey so that they live a holy life. And what they will obey is all the picture lessons and all what they've learned in the New Testament, the New Covenant, and they accept Jesus, and then they live in the power of the Spirit of God. But the reminder that that's the only way, even for those who do not know Him. So the glory of the Lord returns, and the stress in the worship and the stress within that time is upon God's holiness. Yes?
I had a question in trying to understand verses 10 through 12. If I look at it, from my understanding, and please correct me, he's talking to the literal remnant of what's left of the Jews there in captivity. And my question is twofold. Number one, what is it about the description of the physical characteristics of the temple that is going to remind them of their iniquities and hopefully bring them to repentance? And the second part of my question is, he says here in verse 11 that he is to write down everything that he's seen, the dimensions and everything, so that they may observe all of its laws and all of its statutes and carry them out. if I'm to take that into the context of what he's talking about, it seems to be that God is having a desire for them to begin carrying out this millennial temple regulations in a literal form. I would take it. So can you speak to that?
Well, I'll start at the back and go forward and backward. No, yes, I do think they were to do this because they're to live at that time a holy life. They hadn't done that. The temple was a reminder to them that this is where God visually it's a representation where God visually is among them, and God is holy. And they had not responded and respected the holiness of God. They ignored the holiness of God that was manifested in the Holy of Holies, in the holy place, in the worship that was supposed to go on there, was all to be a picture, and everything that they do here, he says, is to manifest His holiness and is to be a witness to them of that. In the process, they will remember their past. But that doesn't mean they dwell in their past. They remember their past, and they worship Him in holiness, and they live in holiness, and are reminded of the marvelous things He's done for them. It's just like today, we remember what God saved us from. I hope we haven't forgotten that. I think it perhaps is easy sometimes to forget that. But to recognize that it was the marvelous, wonderful grace of God that delivered us from our sin. But we are now to live holy. That's why we were delivered. We are to be pure in our life. We are to represent Him correctly. So I think that's what's happening here when he goes and discusses these things. And I think you're right when he says to them that you need to know all these things and write them down so that you can follow them. This, in your worship, we're going to worship the holiness of God, and here's how you can do it.
So, if I understand you right, your emphasis here in this particular verses would be, or God's emphasis would be more on the holiness than so much on the liturgy, because it seems to be in verse 11 where he says, write this down in their sight so that they may observe and all of its laws. That's all he talks about is liturgy, and so. But
I think specifically the liturgy that you will see here, that he will go on and describe. Obviously, it's not full blown of what you had in the Mosaic context. I've already mentioned there are some modifications. There are even some omissions. Omissions create some difficulty to us interpretation because you have to ask the question, why are they omitted? And again, we're working with silence unless we have some contextual or some solid theological basis upon which to understand the omission. But I do think that what he's saying is that the purpose of what now is being revealed is to focus and to direct you and guide you to focus upon the holiness of God. And that's why I say this is worship, and these things that therefore are commemoration, they're reminders, they're remembrances of what he has done that lead and drive them to see the holiness of God in His purity and His person, which has been a problem all through Ezekiel, which has been a problem because they have disobeyed His ways. And they have not lived a holy life, and therefore they have not fulfilled their vocation to be a kingdom of priests.
Given that we have this plan of the temple here, and I'm not too familiar with all the historical background, but the exiles, when they returned, they began to build another temple. Is there a reason? Because as far as I understand it, that temple does not match this one here in terms of its appearance and whatnot. Is there a reason why they wouldn't use this design, or they wouldn't begin to pursue that?
Well, that's a good question, because they would have had it. Yes, very clearly. They didn't even pursue the other one very well until they got a little prod from the prophets of God. If you remember, their attention was directed elsewhere, and they let just a few little oppositional factors cause him to stop. Now, when Haggai and Zechariah come along, especially as we see in the book of Haggai, when God speaks through him and basically says to them, guys, you better stop and consider what's happening in your life. You know, you eat and you're still hungry, and you drink and you're still thirsty, and you go out and you earn wages and you put it in a bag with holes. All of us know about that. And, when those things happen, I think part of what Haggai is saying at that point, when those things happen, it might be good just to stop and do some evaluation, ask some questions as to maybe why is this happening. I'm not saying every time you're hungry, you've disobeyed the Lord. Every time you're thirsty, you've disobeyed the Lord. No. But when this is a consistent, ongoing thing, and these things are happening in your life, it's a good thing to stop and take inventory. And so he says, in the good King Jimmy, which I think probably expresses it best, consider your ways. That's a good thing to periodically do, consider our ways. And I think they did at that time. And I'm excited about the fact that they immediately responded. They didn't say, oh, well. No, they came, and under the leadership of Zerubbabel and Joshua the son of Joshadak, they came and they began to rebuild the temple. And that's then when you have the message of Haggai that I say I'd always like to deliver, where he delivers this one sentence message and says, the Lord is with you, and sat down. They didn't have any problem with it, short message. I think people today would wonder, when are you going to finish? Is that all? What a phenomenal statement. The truth of that is a phenomenal truth of Scripture. All through the Old Testament, you continue to have the statement of the Lord, I am with you. He's with us all the time. The Spirit of God lives within us. He's with us. Wow, what a tremendous truth that is. Well, I think they built a temple the best they could at that time. I can't tell you why they didn't follow this design. It's certainly different. Number one, I would say that probably one of the reasons why they didn't is because the topographical changes here had not taken place. And unless you have those, it isn't going to fit. In the situation of Jerusalem as you would even know it today. So that would be my primary thinking of why they did not follow this design and basically reverted to the Solomonic design, though they weren't even able to do it like that. It wasn't even that big. So that if you remember there that you had the older people who mourned and cried because the glory of this temple was not like that of Solomon's. Now, the ordinances that we've been talking about, a lot of those begin in 43 verse 13 and following, actually go through almost the end of 46. And he gives directives for maintaining the holiness of the temple. Again, we have to recognize what is the law of the temple there in verse 12. It is the fact that all the surrounding area and the top of the mountain will be most holy. Or is the temple aspect here. Instructions are given for the consecration and the construction and the consecration of the altar of sacrifice, as well as the regulations that are to govern the proper use of the temple. And these are to enable them to know how to keep the temple holy, to do what is the righteous, and the picture lessons that will convey the holiness of God continually as one comes into that context. Ezekiel 44:10-31 is going to set forth the ordinances for the priestly conduct. The sacred district will be marked out in chapter 45, 1-8. And then we will have a kind of a parenthesis where he stops and makes exhortations to the people at his time, the leaders of his time. And he interrupts for that in the latter part, in verses 9-12 of 45. He then discusses the worship duties of the prince or the leader. that will be delineated into chapter 46, and then the manner in which the priestly function took place within the various kitchens. Now the altar, let's just look at each of those briefly. The altar of sacrifice, its basic design is quite clear. You can sit there and follow the dimensions and you can build it, and it has a stairs that goes up on the end of it, and it is not exactly easy. It's located between the inner court and between the sanctuary and the eastern gate in that particular context. The steps on it are in contrast with the Mosaic system. What about ascending and going up on the altar of sacrifice in the Mosaic system? Did they do that? Yeah.
There was supposed to be no stairs.
No stairs. Why? Because they did not want anybody up on top of the altar, because it's above the heads of the people, and they did not want anything that would manifest at that point, what it seemed to them, where one could say there is sin or exposure that's being made at that point. Now the millennial altar here is extremely large. You figure out all the cubits there, but it's 32 feet square, and it's 19 feet high. And you get up on top of that, and there's not much you can see in that sense. It's too far away. But I can't answer the question really of why there's steps here, and they're not steps on the one in the Mosaic system. But here's one of those modifications within the construction. But it is viewed as if that which is manifesting the holiness of God. They have to cleanse it, and they have to dedicate it. This is so that it will again be a picture of holiness. Whatever is here that is used of God must be pure. It must be cleansed. It is made by humans. Therefore, it needs to be cleansed and it needs to be dedicated, just as the altars of sacrifice within the tabernacle and the temple. This took 7 days for them to do, and you have a purification offering. This is simply a picture lesson of the fact that you need to do what's necessary to make sure that this object, the altar itself, is pure. That sense of atonement. It is covered for any sin that would have been manifest to that. The Old Testament talks about the fact if you touch something, it doesn't make it holy, but if you touch something, you can make it unclean. Because we communicate sin one to another. We only get holiness from God. I do not pass my holiness on to you, but I can certainly contaminate you. These are picture lessons that are very visual, very everyday idea of it. And here we have the covering or the wiping away or the cleansing of the altar so that it would be holy before God. And he goes through the whole process of that. And after the ceremonial cleansing, then the priests began to present the burnt offerings and the fellowship offerings for the people. What's the basic thrust of a burnt offering? No. We get the fellowship offering, Thanksgiving. And the burnt offering is a offering that's used in many, it's even used in the sin, along with the sin offering for in this sense purification or atonement. But it's also a concept because of its consumption. It continually also manifests an element of commitment, or in other words, everything goes to God in this offering. Very interesting that for the people, he's mentioning the burnt offering and the fellowship offering. That which says the foundation of all that you have comes in what God has done for you, and the efficacious work, and you are to have full commitment. You should be totally committed to Him. Everything belongs to Him. And give thanksgiving in the fellowship offering. It's another phrase. Offerings have different names at different times. But thanksgiving to God for all He's done. And in worship, I think those things are true. There should be continual renewal of our commitment to Him in worship. How can you worship God? How can you focus upon God without us seeing ourselves and recognizing our great need and how we are finite and He is infinite? We are sinful men and women who have been delivered, but He is sinless. The constant contrast as you focus upon, and that's what happens in praise, as you focus upon the character of God and who He is. He is omniscient. He knows everything, and I don't begin to know hardly anything. Sometimes I think it gets worse about what I know. He's omnipresent. He's everywhere, and I'm just right here. And He's almighty, and I'm so weak I can't get out of bed. You begin to see in contrast. This is why we need to know God. Because as we know God, then we know ourselves. And we know ourselves in a right way. It's hard to have pride if you really know God. But you also know His grace and His mercy and His love and His compassion and His long-sufferingness. All of those things that are true. His omniscience, read Psalm 139, it's very clear. His omniscience is to meet our needs and our protection. He knows everything, and He walks right alongside, and He's there to assist us and help us. Whether it's from the rising of the sun to the setting in the east, He is present to help. Isn't that a tremendous truth? Get to know God better. And then we'll get to know ourselves better. And then when we worship Him, we should focus upon Him, but in the process, there's confession. There's commitment. There's thanksgiving. You see, that's all of what goes on within the concept of worship. The East Gate, chapter 44, verses 1 to 3 have the regulations about the East Gates to remain closed permanently. Why? Because of reverence, we might say, for the gate's special sanctity, because it was through that gate that the glory of the Lord came and entered the temple. And it's a glorious place. And out of representation to them visually, we're going to close this gate. Okay, it's off limits for Israel as a picture, because this is where the glory of God Himself came into their presence. By the way, in all the worship, God's there. Okay, so He understands very clearly that the work is finished. That's taken place. So it's there for the reverence of God. They entered into the temple place. They were not to use this gate at all. Now, some of you may have heard, or you will read, that there are people that think that this is the golden gate that you will see on the east wall of around the temple complex in Jerusalem today. I'm sorry to dash your hopes or your aspirations, but it is not. Okay? Number one, the dimensions are entirely different. Okay? And the gate you see today, the Golden Gate, is a gate that was built by Suleiman. Okay? It's not New Testament. New Testament gate's underneath, below the ground. It is there, by the way. I have a very good friend who was out taking pictures of the Golden Gate, and there's a Muslim cemetery there, right along that side of the wall. And suddenly he wasn't standing on terra firma. He was down there. He fell through the top of a tomb. That's a scary situation. And when he finally got his wits about him, turned around, he did have his camera because he was taking pictures. He looked up and he saw the pillars of another gate system right underneath. Okay? So there's another gate under that one. Okay? And that's, by the way, as I often say to people when I'm in Jerusalem, Jesus does not walk where we walk today. He walked about 12 feet below. It's not the same. There's a lot of debris that's collected since. So no, we have not seen this gate at all. Only the prince was permitted to enter this gate. Now that raises an interesting question. He entered and he left by way of the outer court and the portico of the court only, and the function that he did within that gate was to eat bread in the presence of Yahweh. Now, exactly what that meal or why he ate bread in there is not stated. I don't know. And I'm not going to speculate, because that's all it would be. Nor do we have the identity of the prince, or in this case. A prince denotes royalty. Actually, probably the better rendering, as I mentioned to you, of Nasi is leaders. So we may even move outside of royalty per se. Very interesting article written by Spicer on the background and the function of the biblical Nasi in the Catholic Biblical Quarterly, number 25. You might want to read that article about the concept of the Nasi. This leader, therefore, was not the Messiah because he made a sin offering for himself. I've already mentioned that. We read that in chapter 45 and verse 22. Here where he's going on to talk about various offerings of that day. And when we come to verse 22, we say on that day, the prince is to provide a bull as a sin offering for himself and for all the people of the land. It appears he's a leader in worship for the people. And he was the only one that we have that was permitted to enter into the gate where the glory of the Lord had come. And there he ate bread. And as I say, I don't know what is the significance of that. But it's certainly not the Messiah because he offers a sin offering for himself, and the Messiah didn't sin. Okay? And he also, we're told in chapter 46 and in verse 16 of the text, it says, this is what Adonai Yahweh says, if the prince makes a gift from his inheritance to one of his sons, it will belong to his descendants and so forth. This prince has sons, and I don't think that probably fits too well with Jesus in the context of what we understand. Some people have sought to identify him as David in light of chapter 32 and so forth, but there's nothing in the text whatsoever that does that. The identity is unknown for us. He functions, as I said, essentially as the people's leader in their worship time, almost like a high priest. But there's nothing. Don't write down he is the high priest. Please don't write that down. Okay, I did not say that. I said he functions kind of like a high priest, though we're never told anything at all that he had that role or function, and in all of its entirety. Chapter 44, verses 4 to 16, talk about the priests in their service in the temple. As Ezekiel saw the glory once again filling the temple, the immediate response on his part was reverence and awe, and he falls prostrate in worship. That's his continual response to the holiness and the glory of God. And again points up the importance of holiness that is to characterize the priest in their action. Remember, Ezekiel is a priest, not just a prophet. Remember, he is the son of Buzi, the priest. A priest. Now the priest's role then, both in the Mosaic system and here, is to instruct the people in holiness by their teaching and by their lives. Oh, it's a both and. And that's exactly what the Scripture continually tells us throughout. As you come in the New Testament, those that are in leadership of the church are to equip the saints by teaching, by the pastor-teacher type functions. But they are also to be, as the qualification of the elders of the presbytery, they are to be examples to the flock. To both and. I teach with my mouth or whatever, or with my drama or whatever the kinds of things that Ezekiel does. There's different ways to communicate. But we are to live out what we do. And that's what James is telling us continually. You know, what you believe should manifest itself in what you do. And there's a verse in James 4:17 that if you've never read the verse, I'm going to tell it to you now, and you're going to say, "Oh no, I wish you had never told me that." It says, "If you know how to do what is right and you don't do it, it's sin." Now you're stuck, aren't you? Because if whatever you know, whatever you've learned here, and you're not practicing it, it's sin. We need to do what we know. You say, "Wow, boy, I know too much." Then start doing a whole lot. Practice what you know. That's what it's for. We're not just trying to get our heads real big. You know? We're trying to get it manifested in our lives, and as leaders, we're to be examples, we're to be models. That's an awesome thought. But it's that responsibility that God set before us. That was the responsibility even of the priest. They were to communicate and instruct by their teaching, the holiness of God, and by their lives, and their word and their function. And this is, I think, why Ezekiel was exhorted to watch and to listen carefully to all these regulations as we read, and to tell them so that they would know how to represent Him correctly in the worship of what's going on at this time. We read in chapter, in verses 6 and following, it says, "Say to the rebellious house of Israel," it's in chapter 44, "enough of your detestable practices, O house of Israel. In addition to all of your other detestable practices, you brought foreign uncircumcised in heart and flesh into my sanctuary, desecrating my temple while you offered me food, fat, blood, and you broke my covenant. Instead of carrying out your duty in regard to my holy things, you put others in charge of my sanctuary." Let me just say this. That was not uncommon among the pagan religions. They would bring in foreigners to assist the priests in pagan religions in Old Testament times. And sometimes they would end up assuming the role of the priest of that particular religion. And Israel did the same thing. Where did they start having the foreigners come in and assist and do some of the gopher work, if I can put it that way, for the work in the temple? You know, go getting the water and the wood and all this type of stuff. Yes, the Gibeonites, way back there. And remember what it says in Judges 9:14? It said, "But we did not consult with the Lord before we did that." What an indictment to us. That's why, men, we need to always, about everything, talk to the Lord first before you make a decision. Somebody says, "I got to know right now." I say, "Well, then I guess you just don't know." You know? "Well, we need you to do something. We need to do it right now. You know, can you come do it right now?" I need to ask God about this. "Well, but it has to be." Well, then you have to find somebody else. Are we willing to do that, or we say, "No, I want to do everything that happens"? No, let's know what God wants us to do. Let's be sure we inquire of Him. Okay. Well, they're not to do this any longer. Obviously, in this context, they are to be God's people who are carrying out the leadership of the worship time, those who are circumcised not only of flesh but of heart, to minister in the priestly functions. That's the way it was supposed to be in the Old Testament situation as well, as those who would handle the functions of the priest to maintain the holiness of the sanctuary. Okay? So, there are... let's continue on in the discussion here. Verse 13. "They are not to come near to serve me as priests, or come near any of the holy things, or my most holy offerings. They must bear the shame of their detestable practices. Yet, I will put them in charge of the duties of the temple and all the work that is to be done." And he's speaking here of actually the Levites. The Levites were not the priestly role. The Levites here are doing the assistance to the priests. The priests are of the line of Zadok. We don't have time to go back to see the division of the lines and all the arguments, what happened back there biblically. But the major priestly functions now are being handled by the descendants of Zadok. This was foretold back in 1 Samuel chapter 2 in that situation. And they alone were the ones at that time who remained faithful to the duties of priests within the house of the Lord when all the rest of Israel had gone astray. And because of their faithfulness, God would give to them the unique ministry that's even here in the millennial sanctuary to those of the family of Zadok in the tribe of Levi. The rest of the Levites were there. They carried on the functions of assistance, preparation, and so forth. But it was the Zadoks who actually did the priestly type service because they had remained always faithful to the Lord. They alone would be permitted to enter the temple and to approach the Lord's table at that point. It's interesting in verse 16 where he says, "They alone will enter my sanctuary. They alone are to come near my table to minister before me and perform my service." Now, my table is an interesting phrase. What it actually meant has been discussed, and I think we could say it's not something that we can be absolute certain about. The only table that we know of in the temple that has been mentioned that would even come close to being a table or somewhere you put something would be the altar within the outer sanctuary, and it's not called a table in Ezekiel. You see, we have some omission. Whether there was the table of showbread and so forth, we don't know. It's not mentioned. Those are questions that we ask, and we don't have answers about some of the things that are not furniture in the presence and some things that are. Yes?
Back to the Zadokian priesthood. Would some people connect that to Numbers 25, the promise to Phineas for perpetual priesthood, or sometimes called the priestly covenant? Would that be, I don't know if we know the genealogy of Phineas to Zadok, but...
Yes, well, there are definitely those who have. Yes. And that's something that that you have to think about, and that. But it is of the line of Zadok that follows through. That carries on from that time. And it's through him, because of their faithfulness when others went astray in 1 Samuel, that they are there. The Zadokites, or whatever we want to call them, would offer the sacrifices for the prince. Prince did not offer the sacrifices, but they would offer them daily for the people, and they would do it on the Sabbaths, and they would do it on the appointed festivals. And in the latter part of chapter 44, we're told about about them and some of their function. 17, when they enter the gate of the inner court, they're to wear linen clothes. They must not wear any woolen garments while ministering at the gates of the inner court or inside the temple. They're to wear linen turbans on their heads and linen undergarments around their waists. And again, the reason for this is because the white linen was a picture, lesson, of purity. And the priest is to be a model, an example of purity, not only by what he does, but even by what he wears. So as a result, he says they must not wear anything that makes them perspire. You didn't know that when you perspired that you became unclean, did you? Unless you did it for a while and other people recognized you were unclean. I used to recognize that all the Israelis were unclean in the summer when we'd ride on the buses and they would all hold on to the bar up here like this. Okay? And when they go out into the outer court where the people are, they are to take off the clothes they have been ministering in and are to leave them in the sacred rooms and put on other clothes, so that they do not consecrate the people by means of their garments. Again, the concept of the picture of the holiness touching something would make something holy. It's a picture lesson. They're not playing games. They're not just saying, well, this is a nice little outfit to wear. We got the priestly outfit. It was specifically to be white linen as a picture lesson of the purity of the priest, and it was to be kept in the place of ministry within the holiness of God within His temple. Okay? And so therefore, when they were to do everyday activities, then they would change their clothes and put on other garments. Verse 20, they must not shave their heads or let their hair grow long, but they are to keep the hair of their head trim. Okay? So you're not to shave your heads, and you're not to be long hairs. You're to be just like most of you. Okay? You're a good priest. You got it right there in the middle somewhere. Okay? They're to keep it trimmed. No priest is to drink wine when he enters the inner court. They must not marry widows or divorced women. They may marry only virgins of Israelite descent or widows of priests. Again, it's because of the picture of purity. It's the picture lesson. Not that there's anything wrong with other women, but they're not to do the divorced women or to marry widows unless they're widows of priests. Okay? They are to teach my people the difference between holy and the common, and show them how to distinguish between the clean and the unclean. See, there it is. That's their ministry. They're to instruct on what is holy and what is profane, what is clean, what is unclean. These are all saying it in just a different way for them. And in any dispute, the priests are to serve as judges and decide according to my ordinances. They are to keep my laws and my decrees for all my appointed feasts, and they are to keep my Sabbaths holy. They are carrying out basically the functions of a priest would have carried out under the Mosaic system. But the priest under the Mosaic system, if he's really following his priesthood correctly, is to be a picture of the holiness of God. So that people would learn from him, and they could do what Exodus 19:6 says. They could be a holy nation. So they could be a legitimate kingdom of priests and represent God to the world as a holy God. Not to give a false witness, but a true witness. And therefore be able to bring the world to God in their priestly function. A priest must not defile himself by going near a dead person, because that was a picture of defilement. Again, this is something people say. I think people understood in those days. It was a picture because when a person is dead, there's disease that comes quickly. There's decay that comes quickly. And this is why a person that does is to wash their hands. And as you all know, if that had taken place back at the time of the Black Plague, it would not have continued if the physicians who touched the dead bodies had washed their hands. Too bad they didn't read the Old Testament. No? The principles are valid because it's just in God's sovereignty. He knows how to keep things clean. You see, the Mosaic Covenant was given so you know how to live life the best way. Because God knows how it's to be lived. It's very practical. It's not a bunch of heavy burdens that people carry around. It's actually a way to know how to do things right. And for our good, for our well-being. So they're not to touch that. It says, however, if the dead person was his father or mother, son or daughter, brother or unmarried sister, then he may defile himself. He doesn't have to. But in other words, there's concern for family at this point. And okay, if you do, you can do that. Then he may defile himself after he is cleansed. So you see there's going to be a necessity to cleanse because of the picture lesson. If he's been defiled, he has to be cleansed. He must wait 7 days. On the day that he goes into the inner court of the sanctuary to minister in the sanctuary, he is to offer a sin offering for himself, declares the sovereign Lord. Is that something because his sin was not forgiven by the Messiah who would come? No, it was. It's a picture lesson of holiness and righteousness and cleanliness, so that one is holy, that is being represented to the people by the function of the priest. They are continually, by what they do, not only by what they say, as we saw, they not only taught, but they also were to do in order to manifest the holiness of God. That was their function. And I hope you have a priestly ministry in the sense of doing the same, speaking the truth about what is holy, and living as a model. We go on to see, he says, and I am to be the only inheritance the priests have. Verse 28. You are to give them no possessions in Israel. I will be their possession. They will eat the grain offerings, the sin offerings, the guilt offerings, and everything in Israel devoted to the Lord will belong to them. The best of all the first fruits and all your special gifts will belong to the priest. And you are to give them the first of your portions of the ground meal, so that the blessing may rest upon your household. We're blessed when we give to the priest. And by the way, this is why you come to Malachi, and the people were saying, that God doesn't exist and He's changed and all this. And God said, well, just test me. Just find out. It's the only place we have in the Scripture where God challenges people to put Him to the test. He says, bring your tithes and offerings, which, by the way, are so the priest can live, among other things. That's the way they received it, which gives us an idea that maybe people in ministry ought to be supplied by the people to whom they're ministering, which we have some statements about that elsewhere. But he says, go ahead, do it. Test me. Try me. See if I won't open the windows of heaven and pour out abundance upon you. Test me. Just see if I don't do what I say. If I'm not faithful to the ways that I've set before you. God delights for us to give and to support, and by way of worship, by the way, through sacrifice not only of animals, but of what we have. I don't have too many animals, but I can certainly give my car to Him rather than the bull. Oh, not my car. That cost a lot of money. Well, so did the bull they had in their context. We're to be a model of what is holy. Okay? And so they would carry out this. They are fed by the grain offerings and by the guilt offerings, by the offerings that are brought to the people. And the priests in verse 31 must not eat anything, bird or animal, found dead or torn by wild animals, because it's defiled at that point. But He will bless those who bless them. As we come to chapter 45, we now are moving somewhat into the division of the land of the people. And in the land, we have a sacred area. And I'm sorry I don't have overlays or diagrams of the land situation. Let me just put it this way. If we were to have a map up here of Israel, okay? Basically, if you were to draw parallel lines with even spaces between them, there's to be equality among the tribes, as we're going to see, spaced among them. Okay? And right in the center, you're going to have a section that's set aside as a sacred place. Okay? And it's a specific portion of the land in the millennium that's set aside for the priest, for the Levites, for the sanctuary, and the prince, as well as the city. Okay? It will be called a contribution to the Lord. It is His. It is His special portion of the land. And it belongs. It does not really belong to the priest. It belongs to God. It's His possession. The priest lived there on His behalf. And He is, in that sense, He will be their inheritance that they have. And He alone, as we've just read, will be their inheritance. In the center of this slice of the land, in the middle, there is a 500 cubit square area for the sanctuary. Now, by the way, this is this 500 cubit square border. It has a 50 cubit, 500 square area, and has a 50 cubit border that goes around the area. It is separated from everything else. And again, this is stressing the holiness of the sanctuary area. The centrality of the sanctuary is in the midst of the people. Where have we seen that before in the scriptures? The tabernacle. Both when it was stationary and when it moved. It was central. That is a picture lesson. Was it a real tabernacle? You betcha. Were they moving? They were. Were they stationary? Did they camp? Yes. But it was to them, they got the idea that which is central is the core, which is in the middle of us, that causes everything to happen and is where our focus is to be, is upon the Lord. The sanctuary where He visually resides with us. The Shekinah cloud of glory would come, a visual reminder of His presence in their midst and the relationship that He had with them, the centrality of His person. The other 25,000 cubit by 10,000 cubit areas, is 25,000 by 10,000 cubit area that we have here, would belong to the Levites. Okay? And they are the ones who would assist the Zadokian priest. And it would be an area for their towns, and it would run parallel to the portion that was given to the priest of Zadok. Okay? So, again, I wish I had this picture because you'd have this area that's set aside for the sanctuary. It has for the priesthood, for the Levites, for the people of Zadok at the same time, centrally located. And then there was an area that's provided for the city, it says. And by the way, if you have my commentary, you can turn back there and look at the picture. It's right in the back of the end of the commentary. Okay, you got a map there. I don't know the page number, but 980. Okay, 980. I'm sorry, I didn't say. Okay, if you see there that little central portion there of the sacred area that's set apart. Okay. And the city, which is provide for the city, the sea area, probably Jerusalem, but the city isn't named. So we cannot be dogmatic about that. No name is given for the city here. The city area would belong to the entire house of Israel, as it's described for us in the text. And finally, the area that's allotted to the prince. Do you see the prince area? And we have that in verses 7 and 8. The prince will have the land bordering each side of the area formed by the sacred district and the property of the city. It will extend westward to the west side and eastward to the east side, running lengthwise from the western to the eastern borders, parallel to one of the tribal portions. This land will be his possession in Israel, and my princes will no longer oppress my people, but will allow the house of Israel to possess the land according to their tribes. Okay? So he had his parallel to the tribal boundaries also, on the east and the west side of the entire sacred area compound there. This is all central. So the leader, the priest, the Zadoks, and the Levites, the city, and the sanctuary in the actual center of this. These leaders would no longer, tremendous statement there, no longer oppress them. Now, we have exhortations that are given to the contemporary unrighteous leaders. I mentioned we have a princess here. I'm really not going to read that because we've already had enough exhortation to the contemporary leaders throughout the whole book of Ezekiel. But remember, these are the exiles to whom the message is given. And so it's as if we're talking about the holiness, and the prince is to be holy, and he's to lead the people holy. Oh, by the way, guys, be sure you're holy. And check out, and he says in here, you have gone far enough, O princes of Israel, give up your violence and oppression and do what is just and right. Because he's talking to those in captivity. And they're in the process of they're in the process of cleaning up their act. Okay? In every sense of the word of clean. Becoming clean. And they're listening and they're hearing this, which he will recount to them. And we have this statement right in the middle of it that Ezekiel says to the leaders, by the way, guys, this is what a leader's to be like. You've got a ways to go. You need to get something, you need to take care of some things and get your life cleaned up. So that you have accurate scales and accurate ephahs and accurate baths. That's not a bath you take to get clean. And the ephah and the bath are to be the same size, and they're to be a tenth of a homer and so forth. In other words, these men were in leadership. They were dealing with commercial activity, and they were having unjust scales in the process. No more of that, guys. We need to be holy. We need to do things that are right and just and correct. There is the cleansing of the people, referred to in the phraseology of atonement, because that is a term that is used to show that the sin is taken care of, and especially with things that the atonement has, that they have been cleansed before them. And one of the prince's duties would be to make an atonement for the people. In that sense, not expiation for sin, but demonstrating the importance of the need for that and the need for purification if one is to be in a relationship with God, keeping in mind that we have those present who are not. Now, these all different offering stuff that we've already been talking about somewhat are discussed in chapter, the remainder of 45 and in 46. 45:13. This is a special gift that you are to offer, a sixth of an ephah from each homer of wheat and a sixth of an ephah from each homer of barley. The prescribed portions of oil measured with the baths over all the details of this. Also, one sheep is to be taken from every flock of 200 from the well-watered pastures of Israel. These are to be used for the grain offering, for the burnt offering, for the fellowship offering, so forth. The people brought the contributions to the prince, and out of his resources of what they had brought, he then will use that for the offerings that he makes on behalf of the people. That is the function that the prince will do. And the Zadokian priest would do that on his behalf, but it was his responsibility, the prince, to make sure that this is done. In a sense, as the kind of the leader, he is to make sure that these things are done as a picture of the work that has been done for cleansing, and in the context, a reminder to them in their worship that this has been done, and this is the necessity, and this is the picture lesson of it. I want to mention two things. Interesting that we only have 2 festivals or feasts that are mentioned. I've already mentioned you have to be careful because of omissions, that silence operates and argues both ways, so we don't know whether simply these are the ones that are important for emphasis, or whether it's the fact that they simply didn't do anything but these 2. And I cannot answer that because we do not have the data to do that. I do think at least we can say this: these are the 2 that are stressed, or the emphasis, and that's Passover and Tabernacles. And Passover was, I think, a picture, commemoration of what he would do, but it's interesting that the lamb is not used in the sacrifice, but rather it's the bulls and the goats, so that the emphasis very clearly would move away from the imagery any thought one would have on the fact of the efficaciousness of the lamb, more to the sense of the fact of the purification factors that come with the other offerings that are made. It's interesting that Tabernacles is there also, because Tabernacle was a feast which they observed to remember their wanderings in the wilderness. Certainly the exiles were in captivity at this point. They had been out of the land, and when they came back, this feast, when they came out of the wanderings in the wilderness, this was a feast which they observed really as an expression of thanksgiving to God and a remembrance of God's provisions for them, and to bring them out of the captivity to Egypt. Really, I mean, we could say the same thing, and the wilderness wanderings, as well as in this case, by way of the people, the fact that they were in captivity, and and the stress for them is to observe tabernacles and give thanks to God for the fact of what He has done and His deliverance of them from the discipline that they had experienced. Now, I want to wind up here looking at topographical aspects, because that's where the book ends up in chapters 47 and 48. And I think it's appropriate to conclude a prophetic book with a discussion of the land of Israel, especially this book, because the land has been so strategic all the way along. And especially, as we mentioned, that there's that triangular aspect of you have God and people and land that are so tied up uniquely together when you think of a country in those days. And so that's why, they were the people, and if they let God be their God, the one other element is the land. And the land is very much at the forefront in Ezekiel 33 to 39, as we saw. And here we're going to still have it as an important element with which in many ways we conclude not only the land, but conclude the book. So the land played a significant part in their history, and it will do the same here, except we're going to have topographical changes during the millennium, which I think in part gives us, as I've mentioned before, glimpses into the eternal state. Very significant to this, and the very first thing that's discussed is what we could call the temple river, or the river that flows out of the temple, in chapter 47, verses 1 to 12. So in 47, we read that the man brought me back to the entrance of the temple, and I saw water coming out from under the threshold of the temple, that is from underneath the gate area, towards the east. So the temple faced east, so we're talking about the east gate at that point, that we would tend to see, the east, the front of the temple, pardon me, not the east gate, the front of the threshold of the temple. The water was coming down from under the south side of the temple, so it came out and it flowed south, and south of the altar, so it moved out south of the altar. And then he brought me out through the north gate and led me around outside to the outer gate facing east. So if I have the temple here, and this is the front, the east, then the water's coming out and it's going south. It goes around the altar, comes out close to the east gate of the inner court. Okay? And he's following this water that's coming out from the temple itself. As the man went eastward, verse 3, with a measuring line in his hand, he measured off 1,000 cubits. And then he led me through water that was ankle deep. Okay. So it started out as he saw this water just coming out from under the threshold of the temple. And now 1,000 cubits outside of the east gate, it's ankle deep. Okay. He measured off another 1,000 cubits and led me through the water, and it was knee deep in that particular situation. So 1,000 cubits, by the way, is about a third of a mile. Okay? So he's got out here about a third of a mile, and we're ankle deep. 2/3 of a mile, it's knee deep. Measured off another 1,000 cubits, or we're a mile. Led me through the water that was up to the waist. This is a pretty heavy flow coming out. I don't know if you've ever seen that kind of thing. And he measured off another 1,000, but now it was a river that I could not cross, because the water had risen and was deep enough to swim in, a river that no one could cross. And he asked me, "Son of man, do you see this?" I don't know if you've ever seen a river come out of the ground, the underground resource of a river. If you haven't, come to my land, the land of Oregon, and you get to see that type of thing. Water come right out of the ground. Or if you go to Israel, go up to Banyas, or ancient Caesarea Philippi. And go over there right at the cliffs, right where the red rock is, and where Jesus said to them, "Upon this rock I will build my church," in that context. That's where he was, at Caesarea Philippi. But you'll see water coming out of the ground, either there or at Dan. Take either one of the outlets you want, or one of the tributaries of the Jordan Valley, the Jordan River, right at the base of Mount Hermon. You'll see water just looks like just kind of little rivulets coming out of the ground, and suddenly you look out there, and you don't have to go a third of a mile, my friend. In a third of a mile, you got white water. I mean, you want to go whitewater rafting? You can go it on. You can do it on the Haspani River, and you can do it on the Dan, and you can do all the tributaries of the Jordan right there at the beginning. I mean, it just comes right out of the ground, and before you know it, it's a full-fledged river. That's similar, and as I read of this, that reminds me of the type of thing here, of this river coming out, and suddenly it comes out from the temple, and suddenly we're now a river that is so deep you can't swim across it, and no one can cross it. And he said, "Do you see this?" And then he led me back to the bank of the river, and when I arrived there, I saw a great number of trees on either side of the river. And he said to me, "This water flows towards the eastern region and goes down into the Arava, where it enters the sea." Now, the Arava is the Jordan Valley Rift. It's another name for the rift, basically at the Dead Sea and south. Okay, and the sea that you would be talking to, entering the sea here, would most likely, in the whole context, that's the Dead Sea. That's where it's coming to it. So it comes, again, if you've been or if you ever in Israel, you'll notice the topography, by the way. Jerusalem is approximately, not quite, approximately 3,000 feet elevation, more like 2,800. Okay? And the surface of the Dead Sea is approximately 1,300 feet below sea level. Okay? Now you figure out the difference between that, and you drop within 20 miles from 2,800 above to 1,300 below. I'm using 3,000 above to 1,300 below, using round numbers. Okay, you drop over 4,000 feet in elevation in 20 miles. That's pretty steep. And so it runs right down through the wilderness of Judah, which is a wilderness. And that's, I think, significant at this point, because here is fresh water running down through the wilderness of Judah. The only time fresh water runs through the wilderness of Judah today is either by a spring, of which there are few, but not a whole lot, or by rain, and primarily by rain. And when it rains, it runs down there because the rain hits the top of the mountains at the ridge. And again, if you want to sit there and watch geographically, you can stand at the top of the Mount of Olives, and you can see the clouds coming off the Mediterranean and all the rain on the western side of the slopes. That's where all the trees are. And as it comes right up to the top of across the Mount of Olives, the clouds begin to dissipate. And as they go out across the Jordan Valley, there is no rain until they reform on the Transjordan at 4,000 feet in the land of Bash, in the plains of Moab. and you can see them reform on the other side. So, to have a river like this, something that's a river, I mean, you can't even cross, running down through the wilderness of Judah towards the Dead Sea, is certainly unique for them for any time. Okay, so he says it goes down into the Arava as it enters the sea, and when it empties into the sea, the water there becomes fresh. Swarms of living creatures will live wherever the river flows. Let me just say about it being fresh. Have any of you ever heard of the Medaba map? It's a map, it's a mosaic floor in a early Greek Orthodox church in the site of Medaba in Jordan. And it's a map of the ancient Near East at that time in mosaic. And you've got, you have the Jordan River flowing down, and you have the Dead Sea here. And there's a couple of fish in the Dead Sea. You know where they are? Right up close to the Jordan, and they're heading as fast as they can back up the Jordan. Because, they don't want to be pickled fish. That's what they're going to end up with if they stay down there in this place. It's somewhat humorous when you see, because this is back, in the 4th century A.D., and they got those fish, man, and they're headed north. You got to get out of this thing. It's bad news. Well, so to read, I mean, everything's dead. That's why they got the Dead Sea. And so when you read here that the thing is teeming, swarms of living creatures will live wherever the river flows. There'll be a large number of fish because this water flows there and makes the salt water fresh. So where the river flows, everything will live. Fishermen will stand on the shore from Ein Gedi to Ein Eglayim. And there will be places for spreading of nets. And the fish will be of many kinds, like the fish of the great sea. For all you fishermen, when you get there in those days, you can go fishing on the Dead Sea. That'll be an experience. But the swamp and the marshes will not become fresh. They will be left for salt, because they need salt. Fruit trees of all kind will grow on both sides of the bank of the river. Their leaves will not wither, nor will their fruit fail. Every month they will bear, because the water from the sanctuary flows to them. Their fruit will serve for the food, and their leaves for healing. Now, I think it's most interesting that we have this description of water flowing eastwardly out of the temple through that area and making an area that is really desolate come to life. And the basic purpose of this river that we see is to bring life to them. The many trees that line the side of it, the leaves never wither. Their fruit was always perennial. The fruit was provided food, and the leaves provided healing. And the Dead Sea and the Arava are healed, and causing the waters of the Dead Sea to swarm with the marine life. So the guys are out there with their fishing poles, man. They're reeling them in at this point, all the way along. And the Arava blooms. Boy, if you look at the Arava now, I know of no place, not too many other places that are as desolate as the area you have around the Dead Sea and just south of that. I mean, it's just desolate. There's just nothing there. You see all the crusty white minerals and so forth. And to think of that green, boy, I'm going to have to change my colors and my pictures here to get that to going. It's where do we have similarities of a river like this in the Scripture? Revelation and Garden of Eden. We have bookends, don't we? The life that God gives, it's reflected so fully in the Garden of Eden. And that life will not really be like that, and we might say in a sense of perfect environment, until we come to the end time when the Messiah himself reigns. And Ezekiel's telling us about that. There's some minor variations in some of the descriptions of the two rivers, but essentially they're the same. And the fruitfulness and the life that is pictured in the river that gives life to the world. That's the picture of the river. That's the whole concept. It is healing. It is life-giving. It is that which creates a desolate place to become that of we might say, a perfect environment. The land will be fully redeemed, its completion. And remember, it's crying out today in Romans 8 for its redemption. The world, creation. And boy, if you think some of it's beautiful now, can you imagine what it's going to be like then? Wow. When it has its full redemption and is healed, which is visualized by this river. Certainly have no reason to believe that any of these rivers in Genesis and Revelation or Ezekiel are just some nice idea. I think they are there as a representation, as a picture of what God has done in providing the refreshment of life. If they are, we need some further revelation that there's something else, which we do not have here. John in the Revelation, of course, saw the river coming from the throne of God. But what was the temple that we read about in Ezekiel? How was it defined? The glory of God comes and says, "This shall be my throne." Okay. So I don't think we have any difficulties with that. It flows down the street city in the book of Revelation, but that could have happened in Ezekiel as well. We just don't. He's not in the city. He's in the temple. He's watching what's happening in the temple. He's not talking about a city. So I don't think these things are in any way contradictory. I think we see them whether you're in Ezekiel or whether you're in the Revelation. The same river seen in the millennium and the eternal state. If they happen to be two different ones, I don't have any problem with that, but very likely in reference to the same that's going forth. It'll be the source of the land's, in a sense, healing, and it will be healed also and have that healing in the eternal state. Interesting to bring, as I say, that book in, which we see in Genesis, which we see in the Revelation. And as we come to conclusion of the encouragement to the exiles, here at the end of the next to last message of Ezekiel, remember the last one's about one of those that's put in thematically with the judgment of Egypt. So in many ways, thematically, this is the last one. We're closing the book, and we're seeing that in this time of perfect environment, when the Messiah reigns over them, the descendant of David, where those who have possessed the land have been removed, that the final attempt was thwarted of somebody else to possess the land. The people have been cleansed, they've been restored, they're living in perfect security, and they're living in safety in the fruitfulness of the land, and the perfect environments of the presence of the Lord in the millennial kingdom, that this is manifested and brought to a conclusion with the healing of the land completely by the flowing of this river of God. 47 verse 13 gives us the boundaries of the land, and I'll just simply tell you, I've already described to you, they're different. Okay? Sets forth, in essence for us, the way the land will be distributed, and it will be equally divided. Literally what it says there, when talking about equally divided, we took that, the Hebrew text says, each like his brother. Okay? We're all going to have the same. I live in a place now where, back under communism, everybody was equal, except some were more equal than others. Okay? That's not going to be true here. Okay? Everybody will be equal. There will be two portions that will go to the descendants of Joseph, but that shouldn't surprise us because two of the tribes are the two sons of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh. The tribe of Levi will have its special land for their residence. We've already talked about that. They're back there in that special portion of the land in the center of the land. And the boundaries are spelled out for us beginning in verse 15. And the boundaries basically are to start to the north on the coast, and they'll go east and come down around what we would know today, Bashan and and Galantis, and they'll come back to around the Sea of Galilee and follow right straight down the Jordan River, and then come down around where Idumea was in the New Testament time to the river of Egypt, which is that tributary that is a dry riverbed, the wadi there that is just south of Gaza today. I mean, just not south, east, west, south and west, around the corner. And then the west direction of the sea, our border of the sea, is the Mediterranean. I mean, the west border of the land is the Mediterranean Sea. Now, that's the description that we have here, and then we have the equal divisions among them, equality among the tribes that takes place as you go through that. And the distribution. The distribution is made according to the tribes, according to the wives of Jacob. In this case, each tribal area is going to have the equal part, and they start with the north, and they'll go to the south, and each one of them will stretch from the Mediterranean Sea over to wherever the eastern border is. And they start from north to south. The order has no conformity to any of the other orders in Israel's history. It goes according to, as said, the wives of Jacob. So you have on the outer extremities, you have the tribes from Jacob's wives, Rachel and Rachel and Leah are in the center. The faithful tribes in the southern kingdom, Judah and Benjamin, have privileged positions right next to the special land because of Judah's position, and they are the descendants of Rachel. And Leah's they have the special land allotted to them. They are the tribes in the north. Then we'll go from Dan to Asher to Naphtali to Manasseh to Ephraim to Reuben and then to Judah. Okay? That's the order which they'll take. The special place for them goes, however, the special allocations go to Judah and to Benjamin, the descendants of Rachel, the favorite wife of, Benjamin of Rachel, and Judah from Leah. Judah comes from Leah, not from Rachel. I hope we remember that. So even if you have those beautiful big eyes that some want to call cow eyes, that doesn't sound very beautiful necessarily. Leah, though maybe not the one that was the favorite that he went for first, she's the one through whom God brings the Messiah, through the line of Leah. There. So the land is divided among the tribes equally. And we've already talked about that special portion, the special gift or the contribution that is in the center of that, and how it is bound up and worked. And so as you go through 48, you have, as I mentioned, the tribes as you come down in order. And then you have the special portion in 9, down following through the territory of the priests in 13, and then the remaining area for the city and the house and the pastures that are described, initially described in chapter 45, and here completely described as far as that inner core, that inner portion that is the contribution set aside to the Lord. You can see that again if you're looking up on your maps. So this is the land, verse 29, that is allotted to you as an inheritance to the tribes, and these will be their portions. It is entirely different division topographically of the land than what we had in Old Testament times. The portion of land set aside for the special area of the sanctuary and dimensions of the sanctuary and so forth is entirely new. It's entirely new dimensions. Things have been changed. And of course, we know with the eternal state, things will definitely be changed at that point as far as the topography. As we come then to chapter 48, verse 30, These will be the exits of the city, beginning in the north, which is the 4,500 cubits long. The gates of the city will be named after the tribes of Israel. Well, we've had that before. Okay? 3 gates on the north will be the gate of Reuben, the gate of Judah, and the gate of Levi. On the east will be Joseph, Benjamin, and Dan. On the south, we will have Simeon, Issachar, and Zebulun. And on the west, we will have Gad, Asher, and Naphtali. And the distance all around will be 18,000 cubits. Now, what a wonderful way to conclude his revelation to the people. The very last message, really to them, excluding that portion of the judgment speech upon Egypt, that thematically is placed elsewhere. Thematically, he concludes with a message of hope and the message of what what the kingdom, gives glimpses of what the kingdom will be like at the end time, and with the emphasis upon the holiness of God and the worship of His holiness, the holiness manifested in the temple, the holiness manifested in the priest, the holiness manifested in the worship that they do. There is no discussion here whatsoever of anything being salvific. That's not the thrust at all. It is not an efficacious thing. It is a worship of God for who He is and what He has done on behalf of His people Israel. And men, this is really where the Scripture should lead us. It should lead us to worship. It should lead us to stand in awe of a holy, glorious, almighty God. There's none like Him. He is high and lifted up. There's none like Him. And we should fall prostrate in worship before Him. Let us learn to worship. That's the culmination of the book. To worship Him, to live a holy life in light of His holiness. And poor Jerusalem has really been railed on because of its sin and its wickedness and its unholiness. But even Jerusalem can be made holy and delivered. And God has done that. He will do that. Here we are, exiles. We're hearing the final message of Him. We're 13 years into the captivity. We may be wondering what's happening. Will we ever go back? Do we have any hope? Though He's already encouraged them with the night visions the night before the fugitive came to them. And Ezekiel comes and he gives this message in 40 to 48 of what it will be like at the end in the kingdom of God and the worship of Him and the holiness of life. And dear exiles, in God's grace, that's where His people, that's where you, His people, will be. That's what we have to look forward to. That is our hope. And men, we have a great hope. We get to be with Jesus. I can't think of anything more glorious than that. I think, we really have relatively sparse information in the Scripture on heaven. And I think that if we had a fuller description, we'd all probably be clawing at the door, so to speak. Can't wait to get in. And I think of Jerusalem here, the city that God chose to be the place where He dwells among them, and how it was so polluted. But look at the last statement of Ezekiel. And the name of the city from that time on will be the Lord is there. Okay? What a tremendous statement. How gracious of God. He didn't throw Jerusalem away. Jerusalem will finally be that God has called them to be. They'll finally be the people, the city, genuinely His visual representation and living in their midst, because the name will be changed, because for eternity, at least for the millennial context here in that city of Jerusalem, the city's name will be changed in this context, and it will be changed to Yahweh Shammah. Yahweh is there. He's there. He's not going away. He's there. The glory had left. It departed. The glory has returned. He's in his temple. He's in Jerusalem. He is visually there, living in their midst. And they're living with him. And never, never again will they be separated. We have the same hope. And though we need to live holy now, we will live holy then for eternity. It's a great book. Great book on the person of God and upon His grace and His mercy, His holiness and His glory. Let's just close in a word of prayer, our time. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Sabaoth. The whole earth is full of your glory. And Father, our request is the same as the request in the statement in Leviticus and the cry of Peter. We want to be holy as you are holy. And you want us to be that also. Father, may we always recognize that you have died for us. You've given us your Spirit so that we might live holy lives. Holy lives that enable us to represent you correctly to the world as your priest and bring the world to God. That is our vocation. And holiness manifested by your Spirit within us, that we might worship you and declare your holiness and your greatness, that we might live holy before you. This is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.